The stadium was not just alive, it was trembling. 50,000 voices surged together in a tidal wave of sound, shaking the steel beams and concrete underfoot. The night sky above Los Angeles shimmered with the artificial glow of floodlights, each one cutting through the haze like a blade. The stage stretched out like an altar, glowing white under the brilliance of engineered perfection. And at the center of it all stood Michael Jackson. The sequins of his jacket caught every bolt of light and sent them spinning back into the crowd like shards of 1,000 suns. His fedora dipped low, shadowing eyes that already glimmered like the night sky. Every move was precise, choreographed to the millisecond. The twist of a wrist, the snap of a head, the glide of a foot across polished black flooring. He was more than a performer. At that moment, he was gravity itself. The audience leaned toward him as if pulled by invisible force. The band struck the last booming note of Billie Jean, the bass vibrating through the rib cages of everyone in attendance. He froze in mid-pose, one arm extended, fingers splayed. The image held for a breathless moment. Then the stadium detonated with applause, shrieks, tears, a frenzy so loud the very air seemed to fracture. And that's when it happened. Something small and delicate arced across the violent lights. It was almost invisible at first, a fleck of red spinning against the brilliance of the stage. Time seemed to slow. The object tumbled end over end before landing silently at Michael's feet. A single rose. It slid across the polished floor, petals trembling under the heat of the spotlights, its stem still glistening with dew. For an instant, it looked absurdly out of place. Fragile, living softness lay in the middle of this massive concrete and steel coliseum. Michael did not move. Every camera in the arena swung toward the flower. Screens 40 feet tall magnified it for the crowd, turning one small blossom into a symbol projected for all to see. The audience gasped in unison. Security stiffened at the edge of the stage, eyes darting, scanning the crowd for the source. The band shifted uncertainly, hands still hovering over instruments. The rhythm had collapsed, and no one knew if or when it would return. But Michael stayed still, eyes locked on the rose. The crowd roared his name, expecting him to leap back into dance, to launch into the next number, to keep the machine of spectacle rolling. That's what stars did. That's what concerts were. But Michael Jackson was not just a star. He was a man who could feel a whisper in the middle of a hurricane. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down. His hand, gloved in white, glittering with crystals, reached for the flower as though it might vanish if he moved too fast. The glove brushed the stem. He picked it up carefully, as if holding something alive, something sacred. The entire stadium fell into a strange, fragile silence. 50,000 people waited. The sound of breathing, of shuffling feet, even the whimpering sobs of fans trying to hold themselves together, all of it hushed. The only noise that remained was the faint hum of the sound system and the hiss of the wind outside the walls of the stadium. Michael turned the rose in his fingers. Petals shone like velvet fire under the lights. He brought it close to his face, studying it the way a man studies a message written for him alone. And then, without warning, he lifted the microphone back to his lips. His voice was low, not sung but spoken. "Whose heart is this?" The words struck like thunder across the quiet. People screamed. Some cried. Others simply clutched their chests, certain he was speaking directly to them. The massive crowd became a sea of outstretched hands, each one desperately claiming ownership of the flower. But Michael wasn't looking at the crowd. He was staring into the rose as though it held an answer. His chest rose and fell slowly, his breath steady, unshaken by the chaos around him. The cameras zoomed in closer. His fedora cast a shadow, but his eyes glistened beneath it, not with performance, but with something else, something real. He lifted the rose higher, holding it against a backdrop of glaring floodlights. On the screens, it looked like a painting, a single red flame against the white and black silhouette of the most famous man on earth. The silence stretched unbearably tense. Every second felt like a minute, every breath like a drumbeat. Then he whispered again, softer this time, his voice breaking just enough to feel human. "This is not just a flower." The audience erupted, though none of them yet understood what he meant. Some shouted, some collapsed, Some simply cried, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. But Michael remained still, holding the rose as if waiting for the noise to quiet itself again. And it did. One by one, voices faded. Shouts dimmed into murmurs, murmurs into silence. Soon, the entire stadium was quiet once more. 50,000 souls waiting for what came next. Michael walked slowly toward the front of the stage. His polished shoes echoed softly against the floor, every step picked up by the microphones. He stopped at the very edge, staring out the endless ocean of faces. The rose rested between his fingers, delicate, trembling. He lifted the microphone again. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady now, commanding, "this rose belongs to all of us." The words hung in the air. The silence shattered into sound. Cheers, cries, screams so powerful they shook the scaffolding. Fans reached upward as if they could touch him, as if they could reach the flower that had suddenly become more than a gift, more than an accident. It had become a symbol, and Michael had given it meaning. But he wasn't finished. Instead of tossing the rose aside, instead of pocketing it like a trinket, he walked back to center stage and placed it carefully on the mic stand, balanced delicately at its base. It looked impossibly small against the towering steel and glass of the stage, but now it was part of performance. Michael stepped back, silent, hands at his sides. He let the moment breathe. The audience screamed, yet he said nothing. He just looked at them, one man standing against a sea of thousands, holding nothing but silence and the memory of a flower. It was no longer just a concert. It was the beginning of a story. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. The stadium still throbbed with energy, but it wasn't the same energy as before. The explosive roar of a concert had shifted into something unsteady, fragile, unpredictable, like a flame in the wind. Michael hadn't sung a single note since the rose landed at his feet, but 50,000 people hung on him, as if their lives depended on what he would do next. The rose remained at the base of the mic stand, its petals glowing crimson under the lights. No longer just a flower, it had become a symbol, a mystery. Who had thrown it? Why did it matter so much? And why did Michael treat it with such reverence, as though it carried the weight of 1,000 memories? He stepped closer to the microphone. The crowd leaned in, breaths caught in their throats. He didn't sing. He spoke. "You see this?" he said softly, pointing to the rose. "This isn't just something someone tossed on stage. This is a message. It's a heart. It's love." The audience erupted. A chant started somewhere in the stands, then rippled across the stadium. "Michael, Michael, Michael." His name echoed back at him in waves, crashing like surf on rock. But he didn't ride the wave. He waited. When the noise dimmed, he continued. Sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meaning. His voice was low, almost tender. You can live your whole life chasing applause, chasing lights, chasing everything. And then he bent down, plucked the rose from its place at the stand, and held it high. And then something this small can remind you what it's all about. The crowd screamed again, but this time it wasn't frenzy. It was release. Tears streamed down faces caught on the giant monitors. A young woman clutched her chest as though she could feel the words physically pressing against her heart. Strangers who had arrived as separate, isolated fans began reaching for each other's hands, as though compelled to connect by the gravity of what was unfolding. The band, still frozen behind him, waited for a cue, but Michael gave them none. He turned his back to the musicians and faced the crowd alone. The choreography, the set list, the carefully rehearsed machine of the tour, all of it was suspended in this pause. His voice cracked just slightly when he spoke again. "When I was little, my mama used to grow roses in our yard. She'd tell me, 'Michael, these flowers don't last forever, but while they're here, they make the world more beautiful.'" A hush fell across the stadium. His voice trembled with memory, soft but amplified across thousands of speakers. "And every time I see one, I think of her. I think of love, of family, of things that don't fade, even when they're gone." He clutched the rose tightly, almost protectively. "Maybe tonight, somebody wanted me to remember that. Maybe all of us need to remember that." The words pierced the crowd like an arrow. Fans sobbed openly, makeup streaking down their cheeks. Some clutched photographs of him. Others pressed posters against their hearts. In the front rows, people reached out desperately, stretching their arms toward him as though they could bridge the distance with pure longing. Then, as if caught in a trance, Michael placed the rose back on the mic stand. He let his hand linger there for a long moment before he whispered into the microphone, "This rose isn't mine. It belongs to you, to all of us." And just like that, the concert shifted. The band cautiously struck the opening chords of Human Nature. It was softer, slower than usual. The drumbeat pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and quiet. Michael didn't launch into dance. Instead, he sang the first lines with his eyes closed, his voice raw, stripped of performance polish. Looking out across the nighttime, the city winks a sleepless eye. The lyrics melted into the moment. He wasn't just performing a song, he was testifying. Every syllable carried weight. Every note seemed torn from his soul. The audience swayed together like a single body, caught in the current of his voice. Halfway through the song, he stopped abruptly. His hand hovered over the rose again. He stared out at the endless ocean of faces. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. "Yes," thousands screamed back. "Do you feel it?" he repeated, louder this time, his voice breaking into an edge. "Yes," the stadium thundered. Michael pressed a rose against his chest and closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked utterly vulnerable, a man, not an icon. Sweat glistened on his temple, his breath heavy from the emotion surging through him. Then he whispered, so softly that the microphones barely caught it, "Love is the only thing that makes this real." The crowd exploded again. People jumped, screamed, wept. Couples kissed through tears. Friends threw arms around each other. Even the security guards at the front lines, trained to be stone-faced, couldn't hide the way their eyes glistened. Michael stepped back, tilting his head toward the band. The musicians adjusted instantly, launching into Will You Be There. The gospel tones rose like a prayer. Backup singers filled the air with soaring harmonies, and Michael's voice threaded through them like silk and fire combined. But something was different between verses. He stopped singing and began to speak again, words flowing like confession. We live in a world where people forget how to love. They forget how fragile life is. A rose doesn't last forever. Neither do we. But when you give your love, even for a moment, it changes everything. He pointed into the crowd, eyes scanning the ocean of faces. "I don't know who threw this rose, but tonight you reminded me why I sing." The line hit the crowd like lightning. Fans screamed as though trying to prove it had been them, waving flowers, signs, even their hands in desperate waves. Somewhere near the front, a small girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, sobbing, clutching her empty hands, as though the truth of what she'd done was too heavy to carry. Michael raised the rose again and gently kissed its petals. The act was delicate, reverent, as though sealing a promise. He placed it back on the mic stand and lifted his arms wide, cruciform, bathed in white light. The music swelled behind him like a storm breaking open, and as the chorus of Will You Be There filled the stadium, 50,000 voices rose to join him. It wasn't just Michael Jackson singing anymore. It was an entire city of strangers, united by one fragile flower that had transformed into something eternal. The performance was no longer scripted. The concert was no longer a spectacle. It was communion. The music swelled, but the set list no longer mattered. Everyone in the stadium could feel it. Michael wasn't following the script anymore. The carefully rehearsed cues, the precision-timed light shows, the choreography that had been practiced 100 times over, all of it was dissolving in real time. He was letting something else guide him now, something unpredictable. The rose had broken the pattern. As the last notes of Will You Be There faded into silence, Michael kept his arms outstretched, chest heaving from the effort. He didn't move for a long moment. The stage lights dimmed slowly, like the whole arena was holding its breath, waiting for his next decision. Then, without warning, he turned to the band and lifted his hand, a signal to hold back. No music, no beat, just silence. He stepped toward the rose again. It still leaned against the mic stand, petals glowing red in the soft wash of the spotlight. Michael picked it up gently, as though afraid of bruising it. He turned back toward the crowd, holding it like an offering. "Do you understand?" he said, his voice raw, vulnerable, amplified across 50,000 speakers. "This Rose, it's not just about me. It's about all of you." The audience erupted, but he lifted a hand, calm, commanding. Silence fell again. When you give love, when you give beauty, it multiplies. It doesn't stay small. It spreads. Look around you. He gestured at the crowd. You came here tonight for music, for dancing, for excitement. But now you're here for each other. The screen zoomed in on the crowd. Strangers were holding hands. A mother pressed her forehead to her child's. Two friends hugged tightly, tears streaming. It wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about connection. He walked back to center stage, the rose still in his hand. The band, unsure but ready, waited for a signal. Instead, Michael began humming a low, wordless melody. It wasn't part of any song on the set list. It was improvisation. The crowd hushed, listening. His hum grew stronger, richer, bending into a familiar tune. The backup singers caught on first. They began layering harmonies behind him, building a wall of sound that lifted his voice higher. The band followed cautiously, weaving in soft chords, slow and reverent. And then, with a sudden clarity, Michael broke into "I'll Be There." The audience screamed, voices cracking from the sheer force of emotion. Fans who had been silent until now cried out the lyrics with him, word for word, their voices breaking but unashamed. Michael's delivery was different tonight. He wasn't singing to impress. He wasn't hitting every note with his usual glass-sharp precision. Instead, his voice trembled, cracked in places, and that's what made it more powerful. It was raw, honest, human. He clutched the rose against his chest as he sang. "I'll be there to comfort you." The crowd echoed every word back to him, not as an audience but as a choir. It was no longer Michael singing to them. It was all of them singing to each other. On the giant screens, faces were shown one by one. A soldier home from war, standing with tears streaking down his face, a grandmother clutching her granddaughter's hand, a teenage boy screaming the lyrics with his whole soul, as though Michael could hear him alone. The rose had ignited something larger than a concert. Michael lowered his voice to a whisper for the final line. "Just look over your shoulders, honey." Oh, the last note broke into silence. The audience went wild. People screamed his name, sobbed, chanted, collapsed into each other's arms. Michael stood there, chest rising and falling, the rose still pressed against him. But instead of moving into the next rehearsed number, he did something no one expected. He sat down. Right there at the edge of the stage, Michael lowered himself to the floor, legs dangling over the edge. Security panicked for a split second, rushing forward, but he waved them off. He wanted no barriers. He wanted closeness. The crowd at the front surged, screaming, reaching for him. Michael leaned down, brushing fingertips with the outstretched hands below. He looked into their eyes one by one, as though acknowledging them personally. He lifted the rose again. "This rose is a story," he said softly into the microphone. "And tonight, we're going to tell it together." And with that, he began talking between songs. Not scripted banner, not polished stage lines. Stories, real stories. He told them about his mother's roses, how she clipped them carefully and put them in a vase at the kitchen table, saying they made even an ordinary day feel like a celebration. He told them about giving flowers to fans on tours, about the way people's faces lit up when handed something fragile and beautiful. He confessed, quietly, vulnerably, that fame had often made him feel like a product instead of a person. "But when I see this," he said, holding up the rose, "I remember I'm loved, not because of the lights, not because of the music, but because of the heart behind it." The audience cried openly. Some shouted his name through tears. Others simply listened, struck silent by the honesty of it all. He shifted into Gone Too Soon, a ballad he rarely performed live. His voice carried grief and love in equal measure, breaking the crowd's hearts and mending them at the same time. By the time the final note faded, people weren't just watching a concert anymore. They were living a moment that would etch itself into history. Michael placed the rose back on the mic stand, but now it looked different. Not just a flower, not even just a symbol. It was a centerpiece, the heartbeat of the entire show. He looked out at the crowd, his voice almost trembling. You see, a single rose can change the night. And if one rose can change the stage, he swept his arm across the stadium. Then imagine what all of us can do for the world. The audience roared back, their cheers deafening, but charged with something deeper than excitement. It was belief, conviction. Michael pressed his hand to his chest, bowing slightly, overwhelmed. Then, with the softest smile, he whispered into the microphone, "This is no longer a concert. This is love." And in that moment, 50,000 people believed him. The stadium was already trembling under the weight of everything that had happened. Yet everyone knew, instinctively, unshakably, that Michael wasn't finished. He stood at center stage, the rose once more in his hand, turning it slowly as though it held secrets only he could read. The audience had gone from frenzied shrieks to reverent silence, as if 50,000 souls had agreed that noise would only shatter the spell he had cast. The cameras zoomed in tight. His eyes, shining with sweat and stage lights, scanned the endless ocean of faces. "I need to know," Michael said softly, his voice shaking just enough to betray sincerity. "Who gave this to me?" The question rippled across the crowd like an electric shock. Thousands of fans screamed, claiming it was theirs, hands waving wildly in the air. Roses appeared in the crowd, held high, thrust forward as if to prove ownership. But Michael shook his head gently, his hand raised in calm dismissal. "No," he said firmly, "not just anyone. This rose has a soul. Where's the heart that sent it?" The spotlight swept across the front rows, dazzling faces, blinding those caught in its beam. For a moment, it seemed impossible. How could he find one person among 50,000? And then the light froze. There, in the third row, stood a young girl no older than 12. She clutched her hands to her mouth, trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her parents flanked her, their faces pale, as though they hadn't expected this moment to arrive. The rose's twin, its stem now empty-handed, had clearly belonged to her. The crowd gasped. The camera zoomed in, magnifying her small, trembling form on the massive screens above the stage. 50,000 people saw her at once. Michael's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. He stepped forward, dropping to one knee at the edge of the stage. "Is it you?" he asked gently, his voice carrying across the stadium. The girl nodded, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Her mother whispered in her ear, urging her forward, while her father wrapped an arm protectively around her shoulders. But Michael extended his hand toward her, palm open, waiting. Security hesitated, looking at each other nervously. They weren't prepared for this. But Michael waved them back. "It's okay," he told them firmly. "Let her come." The girl stepped forward, shaky, her knees barely holding her weight. With the help of the guards, she was lifted onto the stage. The moment her shoes touched the floorboards, the entire stadium roared, not with the sound of performance, but with the thunder of hearts breaking open. Michael knelt to her level, so he wasn't towering over her. He held the rose delicately between them. "Tell me your name," he said softly, the microphone lowered close enough to capture her trembling voice. She swallowed hard, barely able to speak. "Emily." Michael smiled, nodding. "Emily, that's beautiful." He handed her the microphone, his gloved hand steadying hers. "Why did you give me this rose, Emily?" Her lips quivered. The silence was unbearable. 50,000 people leaned forward, waiting. And then, through sobs, she spoke. "It's for my mom." The crowd gasped audibly. Michael's eyes softened, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Your mom?" She couldn't come tonight. Emily's voice cracked. "She's sick. She loves you so much. She told me to give you this rose, so you'd know she was here in spirit." The stadium fell utterly silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The weight of the moment pressed on every heart, crushing, undeniable. Michael blinked back tears, his lips trembling. He turned his head slightly, as though to steady himself. And then he spoke, his voice breaking, raw. "Emily, your mom is here. She's right here, with you, with all of us." The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of emotion that shook the rafters. Strangers hugged each other in the stands. Grown men wept openly. Security guards bowed their heads, unable to look without crying. Michael rose slowly, lifting Emily with him. He led her gently to the center of the stage, still holding her small hand in his. "Will you sing with me?" he asked. Her eyes widened. She shook her head nervously. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Michael said softly, with a conviction that silenced every doubt. "This isn't about being perfect. This is about love. Tonight, we're going to sing for your mom." The band caught on instantly. The familiar chords of Heal the World drifted into the night air, soft and steady. The stadium roared its approval, then hushed again, waiting. Michael handed Emily the microphone. She hesitated, trembling, then whispered the first line. Her voice was thin, fragile, but pure. "Think about the generations." The audience gasped, then cheered with everything they had. Michael joined her, his voice layering above hers, strong and protective, wrapping around her like a shield. Together, they sang, "Heal the world, make it a better place for you and for me and the entire human race." The crowd joined in, 50,000 voices lifting the song skyward. The sound was overwhelming, a choir of humanity, echoing off the concrete and steel, rising into the night like a prayer. Michael knelt beside Emily as they sang, his hand never leaving hers. The rose lay between them on the stage floor, glowing crimson under the lights, now transformed into a symbol for every person in the stadium. By the final chorus, the sound was deafening. Emily's small voice, Michael's trembling one, and the stadium's tidal wave of harmony blended into something so pure it transcended music. It was no longer a concert. It was a hymn. As the last notes faded, Michael wrapped Emily in his arms, holding her as though she were his own. Tears streaked his face. He kissed the top of her head gently, whispering words only she could hear. When he finally stood, he lifted her hand high into the air, presenting her to the world. The crowd roared their approval, stomping, screaming, crying. Emily's face shone with both tears and joy, her small chest heaving from the overwhelming force of it all. Michael bent down and retrieved the rose. He tucked it gently into her hands. "This isn't my rose anymore," he told her, voice trembling. "It's yours, and it always will be." The crowd exploded, the noise so loud it seemed to shake the earth. Michael kissed her cheek one last time, then carefully guided her back to her parents, who were sobbing uncontrollably at the foot of the stage. As Emily disappeared into their embrace, Michael turned back to the mic, his voice hoarse but resolute. "You see? One rose, one child, one act of love, and 50,000 hearts are changed." The stadium erupted again, but this time it wasn't wild chaos. It was unity. It was faith. It was belief that what had just happened mattered, not just for the concert, but for their lives. Michael placed his hand on his chest, bowed deeply, and whispered into the microphone, "Love is the only thing that lasts." The rose had found its meaning. The roar of the stadium still echoed like thunder, but inside the space where Michael stood, a strange calm had settled. He remained at the center of the stage, chest rising and falling, his gloves shimmering under the lights as he lowered the microphone slowly to his side. For a long moment, he didn't move. Emily was back in her parents' arms. They clutched her tightly, their faces streaked with tears, holding her as though the world had just given them something it had once taken away. All around them, thousands of strangers leaned forward, staring, applauding, crying, because they all knew they had witnessed something far beyond entertainment. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand. His eyes glistened, not from sweat, but from the truth of the moment that had unfolded. He turned once more to the microphone, his voice hoarse. "Do you see now?" he asked softly, almost pleading. "Do you understand? This is not about a concert. This is not about me. It's about love, about connection, about the smallest act." He lifted his hand, holding up the rose one last time. "That can change everything." The rose looked different now. No longer just a flower tossed on stage. No longer just a mystery. It had become a beacon, carrying the weight of a story that would ripple out far beyond the walls of the stadium. Michael turned to the band. They waited, watching him closely. He didn't give them the next rehearsed number. Instead, he spoke again. "Tonight, We're not ending with spectacle. We're ending with truth. The audience screamed, then hushed, desperate to know what would follow. He looked back at the spot where Emily and her parents stood, pressed against the railing. His gaze lingered, heavy and kind, before sweeping across the sea of faces stretched endlessly into the night. "Every one of you," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Every single one of you has love to give. And that love is more powerful than lights, more powerful than fame, more powerful than anything in this world." The band struck the opening chords of Man in the Mirror. The crowd erupted, the sound nearly tearing the sky apart. Michael lifted his head, eyes closed, and began to sing with everything he had left. "I'm going to make a change, for once in my life." The words cut like lightning. He wasn't just singing lyrics. He was confessing, declaring, begging the world to listen. The rose remained pressed in his hand as he sang, clutched to his chest like a lifeline. The screens magnified every emotion. His face twisted with raw feeling, tears cutting paths to makeup, veins standing out on his neck as he pushed his voice beyond its limit. He sang as though his soul itself had been lit on fire. When the chorus hit, the crowd sang louder than he did. 50,000 voices thundered the words back at him, their sound drowning out the instruments. Michael lowered the microphone, letting them carry it, his lips moving silently, overwhelmed by the sheer force of their unity. He raised the rose high into the air as the final chorus soared. "If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and then make that change." The line echoed, multiplied by the crowd, bouncing off steel and concrete, shaking the night sky itself. People lit their phone screens, their lighters, anything they could find, until the stadium transformed into a galaxy of stars surrounding the stage. Michael stood in the center of that galaxy, a lone figure holding up a single rose, the heart of it all. As the final note faded into silence, Michael lowered his arms slowly. The lights dimmed until only a spotlight remained on him and the rose. The silence was heavier than any applause. And then he whispered, barely audible, but carried across the speakers, "Love is the only thing worth leaving behind." He bowed deeply, one hand on his chest, the other clutching the rose. The stadium erupted in a roar so powerful it seemed to rattle the earth itself. Fans screamed, cried, fell to their knees. Others reached for each other, strangers bound together by the moment they had shared. Michael stepped back, looking one final time at Emily and her parents. He held the rose out toward them, extending his arm over the edge of the stage. Security reached to take it, but Michael shook his head firmly. He knelt, stretching as far as he could until Emily's small hands closed around the stem once more. The crowd exploded again, wave after wave of cheers and sobs crashing across the arena. Emily buried her face in the rose, trembling, while her parents clutched her close. Michael stood tall again, his silhouette framed by the dimming lights. He raised his hand to crowd in a silent farewell, then turned and walked slowly off stage. No fireworks, no rehearsed encore, just silence, love, and the memory of a single rose that had changed everything. That night became legend. Fans spoke about it for years. Not the set list, not the choreography, not even the iconic songs. They spoke about the rose. They spoke about the girl who sang with Michael, about the silence that held 50,000 people still, about the way he turned the stadium into a family. Backstage, crew members wiped their eyes, admitting they had never seen Michael abandon the script so completely. It wasn't a show, one whispered. It was something holy. In the weeks that followed, stories spread. Emily's mother, the woman too sick to attend, received a handwritten letter from Michael himself. Inside was a pressed rose petal, preserved from that night, and a note. "Your love reached me. It reached all of us. Never forget the power of one small gift." The letter became her most treasured possession, framed by her bedside. For her and her family, it wasn't just a concert memory. It was proof that her love had been seen, honored, and magnified. And for the fans who had been there, for the thousands who told the story to their children, who replayed shaky recordings on camcorders, who kept ticket stubs as sacred relics, the rose lived on as more than a flower. It became a legend, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gesture can alter the course of everything. Years later, Long after the lights of that tour had dimmed, people still told the story. The Night a Rose landed on stage, and Michael Jackson turned it into love. And in every retelling, the moment grew not as myth, but as memory. A memory of a man who, for one night, set aside spectacle and gave the world something greater. The reminder that love, fragile, fleeting, as delicate as a rose petal, is the only legacy worth leaving. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.